Okay, so it looks like we are getting this figured out, but since you guys are here and we're already at 10:17, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Andra Cascaden, and I'm the Senior Business Manager for New Mexico EPSCoR. And before I get started, I have to tell you guys that my COVID coworkers are two terriers, and they take our home security very seriously. So I apologize ahead of the time if there's any interruptions. And if you guys have any questions, I think chat is enabled, so you can go ahead and put your questions as we go along in chat, and then I will try to get to them as we go along. So today I want to talk to you about project management for the research administrator. And that's a huge topic in and of itself. There are entire institutes and training programs and seminar series about it. So obviously, I can't do an exhaustive study of it in our 45 minutes here today, but what I do want to do is try to give you guys some of the broad introductory information on project management theory, and then try to narrow that down a little bit and show how it can easily relate to our daily tasks as research administrators. So before I get started, I just kind of want to get a baseline from you guys. I'd like to ask that you go ahead and either text or type the response of the pollev.com, that Andre Cascade 009, into your browsers, and let me know how many of you feel like you're a project manager, that you assist with project management, you're really not involved with it, or you're just here because you can't get enough Zooming. And I'll give you time to go ahead and fill that out if you can. Okay, well, there's not a whole lot of us here, and it looks like maybe this is not working too well. But we'll keep this going. And I hope that most of you at least feel like you're at least involved with project management, because I believe that all research administrators are project managers, and I hope it'll become apparent throughout this presentation as to why I think that. So let's define or get some base definitions. So what's a project? Because that's the basis of project management, of course. So the Project Management Institute defines a project as a temporary endeavor that's undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. We undertake projects to fulfill objectives by producing deliverables, and objectives are outcomes that we work towards. They can be something like a strategic position for a company, they can be a purpose, a result, or even a product or a service. Deliverables are unique and verifiable products, results, or capabilities that are required in order to complete a process or a phase or a project itself. These can be something that's tangible or intangible. Projects can involve a single person, or they can also be completed by a group of people. Similarly, they can involve a single organizational unit, such as the PI's lab, or it can also involve multiple units from multiple organizations and be something complex like the New Mexico EPSCoR. It's important to note that the temporary in this definition doesn't mean that there's only a short duration to the project. It just means that there's a definite beginning and an end. A project can end when all the objectives have been met, when funding ends, when the project is no longer necessary, or even due to something like some sort of outside termination from a sponsor, which is something, of course, we never want to see. What it boils down to, I think, is that projects equal change. They're going to take you from a current state to a future state, whether, again, that's something tangible, like a jump in your profits or a prototype, or whether it's something intangible, like an advancement in the body of scientific knowledge, which is what we often see as research administrators. Okay, so then what's project management? Well, there's not really one single all-encompassing definition, and here's a couple of different definitions from different sources. But what I think the important thing to remember is that project management is about getting things done. It's about knowing what you want to achieve and how you're going to achieve it. Okay, so we know what project management is, and we know what a project is, but what's a project manager? So a project manager is someone who leads the project team. Remember, that can be an individual or a group, and that is to meet the project's objectives and expectations. A project manager will balance the competing constraints, between the project and the resources available. And they'll also be the person who communicates between the sponsor, the team members, and other stakeholders. And this can include providing direction for the project and also working to find consensus between all of those groups when it's necessary. And then because projects rarely exist in a vacuum and they're usually part of a larger program, project managers are also going to interact with other project managers. So that means that we have to develop relationships throughout our own organizations and beyond to help achieve the goals and objectives of our projects. Okay, so there are 5 main process groups in project management. The first is initiating, and in those groups is where you're going to undertake the processes to define a new project or a new phase of an existing project. And sometimes that's by obtaining authorization to start the project or the phase, and that can come from a sponsor or from your project team. Then in the planning stage, you're going to undertake the processes to establish the scope of the project, to refine the objectives, and then also define the course of action required to obtain those objectives. Executing is the processes to actually complete the work that you defined in a project management plan that you developed in the initiating and planning stages. And then monitoring and controlling are the processes to track, review, and regulate the progress and performance of your project. And this is also where you'll identify any areas in which changes are required and then go ahead and initiate them. And then finally, closing is what it sounds like. It's those processes to formally complete a project. So I'm wondering if these process groups sound familiar to you. And they should, because the 5 processes of project management are very similar to the life cycle of a sponsored research project. So your idea development is going to most closely align with the initiating and somewhat the planning processes of project management. Your proposal submission and award acceptance are usually, again, part of the planning phase. Your award management is going to involve the executing as well as the monitoring and controlling processes. And then finally, both our projects and our sponsored resources are, our sponsored research are going to undergo those closeouts. So in addition to the 5 process groups, project management can be broken down into 10 key knowledge areas that are going to be used in almost every project. So there's integration management, and that's kind of the stuff that doesn't really fit into any other category. It's stuff like developing the project plan itself, making changes to the project, things like that. Scope management is the work that's actually going to be included in the project. It's answering the question of what work needs to get done to successfully complete it. Your time management is going to be creating, monitoring, and enforcing the schedule and making sure that you hit your milestones and completion dates. Your cost management is going to be your budget control, so that's estimating your project costs and monitoring and controlling them throughout the project. Quality management is determining what's good enough to pass you on to the next phase. That's determining the quality standards that apply to the project and then monitoring and controlling them. Your resource management is where you'll identify, acquire, and manage the resources, and that includes your human resources as well. Communications management is establishing the communication needs of each stakeholder involved in the project, and then doing whatever you have to do to make sure that they're involved and happy. Your risk management, I once heard risk management described as figuring out who the biggest monsters are under the bed and how you don't see them. And I think that's a great example for project management and also for research administration in general. We want to avoid those monsters. Procurement management is also something that it's just what it sounds like. It's purchasing the products and services that you need to complete the project. And then finally, stakeholder management is, again, making sure that you know who all your stakeholders are and keeping them happy. So the Project Management Institute has mapped out all the process groups and knowledge areas to plot out the key activities and some of the key documents that you'll create throughout a project. This chart probably looks pretty tiny to you on your screens and probably kind of overwhelming. And I promise you, I'm not going to go through all of this, not every detail on all of these boxes, nor even most of them, or else we'd be here forever. A lot of these things are just kind of what we naturally do every day as research administrators without really thinking about it. And to be honest, there are some things here that aren't really relevant to us at all. However, there are a couple of things in here that I think are really useful for us. And there are some great resources and tools and tips out there. And that's what I want to move into now, just a few of my favorites. So the single biggest key to successful project management is the development of a project management plan. It's going to serve as a basis for everything you do to get a project from the initiating to the closing processes. It seems really obvious, but it's important that everyone involved in the project knows how everything is going to be done. So especially in research administration, this activity might need to be done more than once, the development of a plan. You'll likely have one plan for the submission process and then another one once you've been awarded. The really nice thing about us is that in our work, we often don't have to recreate the wheel every time, and we can and we should use university and departmental policies and procedures to create a framework that'll work for most of our projects. So depending on the size and the complexity of your project, a thorough project management plan will include subsidiary plans for each of the relevant knowledge areas. As a reminder, that's the things we just talked about, like communications and resources and procurement. But if you don't include any of these knowledge areas for every project, it's absolutely essential that you establish at least 3 baselines, and that's for scope, schedule, and cost, or our budget. And establishing a baseline just means that we're defining those 3 things so we know what we're doing, how long we have to do it, and how much we can spend. So luckily for research administrators, lots of times by the time we get a project, those things are kind of baked in by our proposals and also by our award documents. But it's really critical that we get them down in simple black and white in our project management plans. So for a bare bones plan, you also want a clear definition of the project life cycle or a more detailed scheduled or calendar for your project. And it's also good to know when and what your reporting requirements are, because we know we've all got a lot of those. So I mentioned getting things down in black and white. And is it necessary to create a project, a giant complex plan for every project you work on? Probably not. But I would strongly suggest that you have at least a simple project management template that can be quickly updated and adapted to each project that you work on. It's a great tool for keeping yourself organized and also for making sure that everyone involved in the project understands at least those 3 key baselines. Okay, so let's talk about some tools and techniques that we can use to help us to develop those plans and then also to execute them. So me personally, I think one of the most useful tools for developing a project management plan is a kickoff meeting. This should usually be done in your initiating and possibly in your planning phases as well, depending on what your project looks like. And it gives you a chance to meet with your PI and other important stakeholders to establish how you're going to execute, monitor, and control your project. And it also gives you a chance to establish your timeline and make sure everybody understands their roles and responsibilities in each phase. So a great tool that I absolutely love for these meetings, and it'll get you a little bit deeper than just that executing, monitoring, and controlling, is the use of a project kickoff canvas, which I have up here right now. And I'd be happy to send this to anybody who'd like a copy of it. And this was developed based off of the business model canvas, which is something you might be familiar with if this looks familiar to you. And obviously, it's used to guide your kickoff meetings. And oftentimes, again, this might be something that you want to do twice. So the first time is usually more of a brainstorming process where you just kind of throw everything at the wall. And then you can move into decision making and decide which of those ideas you actually want to adopt. So the canvas is broken down into 8 sections. And you might find, again, that some of the sections aren't relevant to you. But I suggest that you at least visit them in your brainstorming so that you really know whether you need them or not. So the 8 sections start out with desired outcomes, and that's the why behind your project. What are you trying to achieve? Then you'll move on to your plan of attack, which is kind of a high-level roadmap, and it's going to establish how you're going to approach your project. There's usually more than one way to get to your desired outcomes, so you want to pick the best way. Then you'll move on to your major deliverables and tasks. And we've defined that the deliverables are the things, whether tangible or intangible, that are created by your projects. And then the tasks are the work that you have to do to create those deliverables. So for your measures of success, it's important to know what the success of a project looks like and how it'll ultimately be judged. I think we're all familiar with SMART goals, which are those specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound goals that we're asked to do in like our annual reviews. And it's a great idea to make the things in this part of your Canvas SMART as well. So your critical success factors are the things that are going to increase the chances that your project will succeed. So for example, if you're baking a cake, you want to make sure that all your ingredients are fresh and that you have a good oven to bake your cake in. So these critical success factors, or sometimes called CSS, are also things that are going to increase the likelihood that your project will fail if they're not present. So like in an example of our cake, if you don't have a sifter that aerates your flour properly, you might have a dense and stodgy cake, and nobody wants that. So then you'll move into figuring out what your constraints are. And those are the things that limit the options available to your project team. In research administration, we're constrained by things like our university and sponsor rules, and usually also to access to resources, so things like staffing or facilities. So I've mentioned stakeholders quite a few times already in this presentation. And they're the people that are either directly involved in your project, they're affected by the project, or they have an interest or a stake in your project. You want to make sure that you know who all of your stakeholders are, and also that you understand their needs, wants, and perception of the project. And then finally, you're going to figure out what your risks and assumptions are. So risks are the things that could go wrong. These are those monsters under the bed that we talked about and we don't want to see. And your assumptions are here too, because assumptions are things that you assume to be true or factual without actually knowing for sure. And they're considered a form of risk because you could be wrong about them. Okay, so the kickoff canvas is a great way to get you started. And then there are a couple of different tools, which some of them are going to seem obvious, but we'll go through them, that you can use to start to execute your plan. So the first one, and the one that is obvious, is checklists. So it seems silly, but having good checklists are really helpful. And most of us probably have pretty good checklists in our heads, but it's great to actually have a base document that you can share with new PIs or other stakeholders. In a lot of ways, the project management template that I suggested you create can serve as a great checklist for your plan as a whole. But I also suggest creating other checklists for specific processes within your project. For example, some of you have probably seen this checklist below that I did a presentation on a while ago. And this is my sub-award invoice checklist. And this is part of both my procurement and my risk management plans for New Mexico EPSCoR. So another tool that we use really heavily in New Mexico EPSCoR is Gantt charts. And those are a great way to outline and then track your project deliverables and schedules. And you can use Gantt tools that are built into things like Microsoft Projects or Microsoft Teams or any of the other massive amounts of project management software out there, but you don't need anything fancy like that. You can also build your Gantt charts just in Excel, which is what we do. And then on this next side, I have an example of one of the Gantt charts that we use. So these are great because you can customize them to fit your specific project. But every Gantt chart has a couple of things in there that you want to make sure that you include. So the first is going to be your task list, and that runs vertically down the left side of your Gantt chart, and that describes all the project work that you need to do. And you can organize these into groups and subgroups like you can see we've done here. It's arranged by our objectives, our activities, and our tasks. Then you also want to have a timeline, which runs horizontally across the top of your chart. And this can be customized to show the months, weeks, days, and years, or anything that works for your project. As you can see for ours, we've broken it up by grant year and then our reporting quarters. So then you've got your bars or the cells that you see in there. And those are the horizontal markers on the right side of the chart that represent tasks, and they'll show the progress, the duration, and then also the expected and actual start and end dates for your work. Then you also want to show your major events, dates, and decisions and deliverables or milestones on your chart. And we mark ours with an M, as you can see, but you can use any sort of marker that works for you. Then you also will use this to chart your progress, and that shows how far along work is done. And you can indicate that by something like % complete, or you can just shade your cells like you can see we do with that key up top. Then you can add other aspects, like I said, it's totally customizable. So you can add dependencies, which are the things that are related, and they'll show which task needs to be completed in what order so that other tasks can begin. You can also add things like resources, like the specific number of FTEs that are expected to work, or things like materials and equipment and budget amounts, or really anything else that can get assigned to a specific task. So as I mentioned, there are different software packages that include Gantt charts, but Excel workbooks work just as well, I think, because we know them and we're familiar with them. I know a lot of teams also use Google Sheets for similar reasons, and also because they're really easy to share and collaborate on. So another great tool that we use within our office, not necessarily for the project itself, is Trello. And this is a web-based list-making application that's really great, especially for collaborative projects where you have a lot of people working on various interrelated tasks. So in Trello, you create boards which have lists and cards to help you manage your tasks. So we have shared boards for various aspects of our project, like for our communication plan, for example. And the one that you see here is for our website. Excuse me. So the lists are then further broken down, and you can see ours are to do, doing, and done here. But you can customize these lists to be anything that you want. For example, on this board that you can't see it right here, but we also have lists for things like topics for discussion in our next website meeting, or a schedule of upcoming webinars, design mock-ups, anything that we want to share with our project team. So then within each list, they're composed of cards, and the cards are used to represent our tasks or ideas. They can be something that needs to be done. Like here you can see we have a planning meeting that we're organizing, or they can just be something that needs to be remembered or discussed or act upon at a later date. And cards can be customized to have a ton of different information. Like in that planning meeting that you see, we have a draft agenda stored in there, or as I mentioned before, our communication specialist will post things like design mock-ups for feedback. Trello is really cool because the sky's kind of the limit as to what you can add to a card. And then as you go along, you move each card between your lists to show when you've completed something, or even if you've discovered that you have something else you need to do, you can move it back. Another great thing about Trello is that it automatically notifies your project team members of changes. And you can do things like assign cards to certain individuals and set up automatic reminders, or you can even link it to a Slack channel if that's a communication tool that you use, which we use like crazy in EPSCoR now that we're living in a COVID world. So Trello is free, and it's even got some template boards that you can use to get started. And I just can't say how much I love this tool. I strongly recommend it to everyone, and it can even take place of your personal daily to-do list if you want to use it. Okay, so your project management plan, which can include use of tools like Gantt charts or Trello, is only going to be good as your understanding of the tasks and activities in your project. So in the field of project management, there's a great technique called work breakdown structure, or WBS. And Project Management Institute defines WBS as a deliverable-oriented hierarchical decomposition of the work to be executed by the project team. So in English, that's just to say that you're breaking down all of the things that a project needs to accomplish into a graphic format. So there are two different types or approaches to creating a WBS. One is deliverable-based and one is phase-based. Deliverable is probably the most common, and it's the thing you're going to see most often. I actually think phase-based is more helpful for managing a research project because the nature of research isn't always deliverable-based. But that's just my opinion. There's probably a lot of research administrators and PIs that would totally disagree with me. So you'll often see a building project used as an example of how to do a WBS, and that's what we have here. We're building a house. And this is a deliverable-based example. So you can see that the project has been broken down into each of the really big deliverables that need to occur, like completing the foundation or the internal and the external work. And then under each of the big deliverables are the smaller ones that roll into those big milestones. So usually in deliverable-based, each of those boxes is going to be a tangible thing that you need to produce or you need to obtain or that needs to be supplied from an outside vendor. And you can see in this example, they've added things like budget and how much of the total effort each element should take. That's certainly not necessary for a WBS, but if you have it, it's definitely helpful. So here's an example of a phase-based approach, and like I said, I think this is probably more helpful for us. So in a phase-based approach, the first level of your WBS is, well, it's the phase. So in our house building example, we've got design, procurement, which by the way, I didn't make that typo, that's not mine, construction, etc. And then in the second level, we break down our deliverables. So no matter what approach you take, your WBS can and should have as many different levels as necessary to include all of your project work, including the project management work, so things like developing your plans. And the total of the work at your very lowest level should roll up into the highest level, whether it's phased or deliverable based, until nothing is left out. So that means that you complete all the work of your project without having to complete any extra work. And in project management, we call this the 100% rule. So with that being said, it may not be possible to fully break down or decompose a deliverable or a subcomponent that's going to be completed really far into the future. And that's okay. It's okay to put in a placeholder and then fully break down the deliverable once it's been agreed upon by your project management team. This is called rolling wave planning. And like I said at the beginning, projects equal change, not only for your state, but there's changes within projects always. So expect your WBS and your project management to change and to change often. Okay, so we've talked about just a couple of tools and techniques that we can use to make our projects successful. And like I said before, there are tons of tools and techniques when it comes to project management. And I only had a short amount of time, so the ones I discussed with you were some of my favorites and some of the things I find most helpful. And at the end of this presentation, I have a list of some links to different training resources and also sites that have some great templates if you want some more. So I want to take a break now and do something a little bit more fun and look at some examples of what can happen when project management works, and then also what can happen when it doesn't, because let's be honest, fails are always more fun to talk about. So I have one cool example here of a successful project, and then we'll look at some of those fails. So an organization that is really known for good project management is NASA. And a great example of a project that they had was the Autonomous Rotorcraft Project, or ARP. And the goal of this project was to develop an unmanned helicopter that could operate with the decision-making capabilities of piloted aircraft. So it's making a drone that can fly itself. So the project team was made up of experts in various and wide-ranging fields with things like aeromechanics and flight control, autonomous executive software, which is the thing that actually does the thinking, helicopter dynamics, and vehicle health management, whatever that is, I don't know. So NASA hired a project manager who was tasked with developing the schedules and the budgets, communicating with stakeholders and upper level NASA management, and then also overseeing the development of the hardware and the software needed, and then also managing the risk and completing the evaluations. So all of those key knowledge areas that we already talked about. So the project manager started out by defining the scope and then presenting it to all the stakeholders, and then negotiating the project team, negotiating the needs of the project team, excuse me, and with the other stakeholders so that they could come to a final agreement on the scope. Then throughout the project, he worked to keep those communication lines open and set up a really detailed website to track and report on the progress of the project. And this project met all of NASA's needs and was completed under budget, and they were so pleased with it that they nominated it to be the Project of the Year for the Project Management Institute for 2012. So altogether, super successful as far as everyone's concerned. Okay, so now let's look at some examples of bad project management. So one's a literal shipwreck, and then the other is a very famous modern fail. So 58 years before the Titanic, the RMS Taylor sank, having actually sailed less distance than its famous sister ship. The ship was chartered by White Star Line, just like Titanic, and this ship was going to travel between the UK and Australia. And she left Liverpool for the first time in January 1858 with 652 passengers and crew on board. So her captain was only 29 years old, and it turned out he was at the helm of a ship that had tons of design flaws. The ship and the crew hadn't been properly tested or prepped for the journey. So there were things like the compass didn't work, the rudder was too small so you couldn't steer the ship, and it was almost impossible to control the sails because there were problems with the ropes. So less than 48 hours after she left Liverpool, 360 lives were lost, and the ship was entirely underwater except for the tip of her mast. So what can we learn from the poor Taylor? She was sunk due to a lack of due diligence by those overseeing the project. There was also a lack of training for the crew. There was a failure to do appropriate tests of the vessel before sailing, and pressure from management to set sail because this was a really high-profile ship. There was those design flaws we talked about, there was poor quality work, and also just a complete lack of risk management. So a more modern fail, most of you are probably familiar with the Fire Festival. And this was hyped on social media as the most exclusive high-end music festival ever. And it was scheduled to take place on a private island in the Bahamas. It was advertised as having once belonged to Pablo Escobar. It never did, but that's beside the point. So attendees paid as much as $12,000 each, and when they got there, they found out that this festival was taking place in the parking lot of a sandals resort. Their luxury accommodations that they had been promised were unused FEMA tents, and the gourmet catering was cold cheese sandwiches that are now famous. So this festival was clearly a project management fail from every possible aspect from the start. There was absolutely nothing resembling a project management plan, and it's really clear that they never completed a WBS to even be aware of all of the details that no one ever thought of. Cost management was non-existent, so almost all of their funds were spent on social media marketing, and they were left with pennies to buy those famous cheese sandwiches. And I would say this is clearly a project that never even made it out of the initiating phase, despite the fact that about 5,000 people showed up to take part. Okay, so we've got just a little bit of time, and that concludes the meat of my presentation. But if you're really jazzed by the world of project management and want some additional training, I've provided some links here, which you can access on the slides that'll be posted to the Symposium website. So I mentioned the Project Management Institute a lot, and they're kind of the gold standard of project management. They're the organization that provides certification as a PMP, or a project management professional, or CAPM, which is the certified associate in project management. And then they've got a couple of other specialized certifications on there. And their website is great because it also has a ton of information on anything you can imagine related to project management. The Association for Project Management is the UK counterpart to PMI. And their website also has a ton of great resources with things like webinars or YouTube videos and great links to additional content. The International Institute for Learning is actually a private training and consulting agency, and they contract with a lot of big corporations for project management assistance and also to train their employees. And they have a great YouTube channel, which is linked here, and they have a ton of short, super helpful, easy to digest videos on, again, every aspect of project management that you can think of. And finally, if you're really interested in diving into project management and probably becoming certified, UNM's continuing education has a whole series on project management. So there are courses just on that's really hard to say. Courses on practical project management, excuse me. And then they've also got the extensive exam prep for those PMP and CAPM certification tests. If you're interested in using Microsoft Project, they've also got a whole series of training for that software package. If you're not quite ready to dive that deep and become certified and you just want to use some of the knowledge that's already out there, these are a couple of my favorite sites that have some free templates that you can download. So Project Management Docs is run by PMI, and they've got a ton of free templates for everything from project management plans to WBSs and communications management plans. Most of these templates are pre-populated with examples, but the site, also breaks down each section of the templates to help you understand how to complete them for your specific project. MyPM is another great site that has a ton of templates that are broken down by process group. And these are great. They've got great documents, not only like a management plan template, but they also have super helpful things like example meetings, agendas, and checklists. And then finally, UC Santa Cruz has created and compiled some great templates. And the nice thing about these is that most of them are available via Google Docs, so it's really easy to share them and work on them as a team. All right, so I think we've got a little bit of time for some questions. So if you have any, you can go ahead and throw them in the chat, and I will do my best to answer them, or at least point you to a resource that can give you a better answer than I can. Okay, so we have a question from Mary Jo, who asked how you negotiate a management with PIs who want to manage the proposal development process. That's a great question, Mary Jo. And I think it's really important to remember that your role as a project manager is to facilitate and negotiate. And although they may want to manage the proposal development process, they may not have all of the information available or necessary to complete that. And that's another reason why I think it's really helpful to have those plans developed and at least a template so you can show them, you know, yes, you are the technical expert, but these are some of the things that we have to think about the more process, which is probably where you are the expert. And you can just say, run with your technical, but here are all these things you have to think about. And I really don't think you want to be the one in charge of them. This is my expertise. Let me take them on. That would be my excuse. Let's see. So Tamara says, I missed most of the presentation due to tech issues. Will I be able to go back and watch it? And yes, I did hit record at the behest of Tabitha, so I believe this will be available on the Symposium website, and then also I know my slides will be available. Is there anything else? Okay, let's see. So Ray asks, is there a template that is useful for monitoring multiple projects? That's a great question, Ray, because as I mentioned, no project exists in a vacuum, and most of us are managing multiple projects, or at the very least, we're managing multiple aspects of a project. And yes, there are some great templates out there. PMI specifically on that website that I mentioned, the project management docs, has a great template for doing that and for breaking down what different resources are needed for what project. And it does a really good job of helping you to break out the time, which is probably what you're getting at with your question here, is how do you manage your time between multiple projects? So yeah, that is definitely out there, and you don't have to recreate the wheel for that. Great, Ray. I'm glad I could answer that. I can find that template and send to you as well. Okay, so I think we have about 5 minutes left. Is that right, Tabitha? And it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So I want to thank you all so much for coming. I hope that you found at least some nugget in here. Again, this is a huge topic, and I wasn't able to cover as much as I may have liked, but there's a lot out there for you to dive into.